Such a joy and honor to be with you. I so enjoyed the worship as well. I mean, wow. It seems like you think that you're worshiping a God that's not somewhere else, but who's decided to come and make his home right here with you. It seems like you think that you're worshiping a God who's not unknown and transcendent, but a God who has decided to make himself intimately known as your Father. And so love that. Thank you. I'm so excited about this morning. It's so wonderful to just relax and let the Lord reveal himself the way he wants to. Now we do this almost every day. And so if this was a performance, I'd be exhausted. And they've given up a long time ago. But it is so easy when you know that you're dealing with a God who is eager to reveal himself. A God who makes himself known. That I'm not ministering to try and draw out of you some kind of commitment or some kind of response or to demand faith, but we have a gospel that comes to supply faith. A gospel that comes to awaken life. And what was said this morning, everything from what Laurie said onwards has been just such a beautiful confirmation of what the Lord has stirred in me this morning. We've got many, because we do it every day, I just about know everything I'm going to say off by heart, about 20 different messages. But every now and then I just say, Lord, what do you have in mind for them? And, some of the stuff, I never work with notes, but some of the stuff that started stirring within me last night, I think is so specific to this beautiful community and this beautiful thing that's happening here, because you are busy translating the thoughts of God into community, into how that looks and how that works. And so I'm excited about what's going to come out this morning. So, Jesus, we thank you. We thank you that you have come to make the Father known. We thank you that you have not left us as orphans, but you've come to us by your Spirit and Spirit of truth. We welcome you to reveal, to witness, to breathe life into us this morning. We just open ourselves up to you and say, Lord, open our ears, our eyes, and expose yourself in the way that you want to be known. Thank you, Papa. Thank you, Papa. I'm going to give you a quick overview of what's coming. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you. And then I'm going to tell you. And then we're going to conclude with me telling you what I told you. But we're going to start off with me just doing a quick summary. I want to look at specifically how Jesus models us. We're going to start off with looking at what it means to be the image and likeness of God, how this went wrong, and what is the implications for being made in the image and likeness of God. What is the implications of that being becoming twisted and perverted? And then we're going to look at how Jesus comes to once again display to us the image and likeness of God in human form, the way God always had it in mind. And then we're going to look at just one aspect of what he modeled, and that is how he valued people. Because once we discover that Jesus is an example of us, and once you've discovered that, he can also be an example for you. Sometimes we've got the order reversed, and we think Jesus is just the example for us, and we must try to become like him. There's a big difference between becoming and being. You become what you are not. You be what you are. And when you discover that Jesus is an example of you, then you can start emulating him, because emulating him is being who you are. And so we're going to then just look at one aspect of what Jesus modeled, and that is the way in which he valued people. But let's start off with what it means to be the image and likeness of God. You know, animals are basically bound by instinct to be what they are. But humanity has been given an enormous gift, and that is the ability to be whatever you behold. You were made as a being that reflects, as a being that is the image and likeness of your Maker. And therefore, the truth is that you cannot be yourself by yourself. The only way in which you can be yourself is in encounter with the one whom you were designed to reflect. That's when you are fully and truly yourself. You were made as a being that reflects. Made as a being. The first thing Adam beholds when he opens his eyes. Genesis 1:28. And God baraked. That word baraked. An act of adoration, such as kneeling. The first thing Adam beholds when he opens his eyes is his Creator adoring him. It's like you would take your newborn child home and fall on your knees and just cradle that little life and love it, not because it performed well enough to deserve your adoration, just because it came from you. When God created man, he spoke to the substance from which man is made. He spoke to himself. He said, us, let's bring forth man. Our image, our likeness. And God adored man. In other words, this is almost part of the creative process. We are made to adore, and the first thing, we are made to reflect. And the first thing we behold is God's adoration. And so the most natural thing for us to do is to reflect that adoration back. Is to just respond in like kind. In other words, you don't bring any honor or worship or adoration to God by telling him how rubbish you are. Or anyone else. The only way for you to accurately adore him is to reflect the adoration he gives you. We love because he first loved us. We would not know how to love, but to behold his love. We would not know how to adore, but to discover his adoration. That's why James 3 says that how can a spring give bitter water and sweet? And how can you, with this mouth, worship God and curse a man made in his image and likeness? In other words, the most accurate measure of your worship is not the amazing things you say about God. It's what you say about man that reflects on him. This is why John writes in 1 John and he says, hey, don't give me all your stories about how you love God, but you can't stand your brother. Because how can you love your invisible imagination of who God is when His visible image and likeness right in front of you is abhorrible to you? You've missed something. That's why in 1 John 1 verse 7 he says, if you walk in the light as He is in the light. In other words, your enlightenment is not made known by how accurately you can argue your point. Your enlightenment is not made known by how eloquently you can state your doctrine. Your enlightenment is visible in one place only. If you walk in the light as He is in the light, it results in uninterrupted enjoyment of one another. What is the use of what you think is a perfect doctrine if you irritate yourself and can't enjoy people? Hey, no, this message has got one aim: to bring you to the place where you can enjoy being yourself. And when you discover how to love yourself, then you know what Jesus says meant when He said, love your neighbor as you love yourself. Because you're not going to love your neighbor while you're still irritating yourself. They're going to be as irritating to you as you are to you. Probably more, because somehow we must find a scapegoat for my irritation. It's obviously not me irritating me, it must be you. No, so God creates man to reflect, to be what we behold. And we are made to behold Him. But whispering voices comes to bring accusation, comes to tell us that God doesn't really want us to be like Him. That there's something we must do, and by doing this we can be like God without God. And so man partakes of a certain knowledge, and for me it is very significant that the predominant picture of what brought evil into this world is not a horned little fellow with a fork, but the predominant picture of what brought evil into this world is a tree of knowledge of good and evil. In other words, evil would have no space or existence in this world if man did not partake of a certain kind of knowledge. And so man partakes of his knowledge. We lose sight of God. And what happens next? In our bewilderment, in our confusion, we start looking at one another to reflect one another. We do not even trust our own desires. Now you can read Rene Girard, and he had a lot of input in how we understand anthropology, the development of human communities, etc. And how in this place in which we reflect one another, it always escalates to violence. Let me give a picture. They call it mimetic realism or mimetic theory in psychology and in anthropology, but it's very basic, the idea behind it. If you had a child, a 3-year-old, sitting in a room full of toys, not really particularly interested in any one toy, and another 3-year-old walks in, the first thing the other 3-year-old sees is the other child. Because we are made to reflect. The next thing that child will see is the toy closest to the other child. And he will head over to that toy. And when he reaches for that toy, the first child will realize, this is the toy I've been wanting all my life. And war breaks out. Or you can see it with children riding a bicycle. I want the bicycle. Okay, I have the bicycle. I'll play with the ball. I want the ball. I want what you want. Now we learn to control it as we grow older. Some of us. But basically, whether it is on family level, national level, international level, that same corrupted image and likeness still plays out, where forgetting who we are made to reflect, we start reflecting one another's desires. And when we have no reference for who we are but one another, adoration turns to accusation. Validation turns to suspicion. Instead of reflecting that favor and that care, we start reflecting a suspicion and a fear. And so in early human communities, what this meant is that I see you have 10 cows, so I must want 10 cows as well. But there's only so many cows. And so reflecting your desire leads to deceptive kind of dealings, because I'm trying to work out how to get what I want. And basically the only way I get what I want is to replace you. And so that competition stirs up, eventually heads up in violence. That's why the 10 commandments: do not kill, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness. It's like he can go on with do not the whole time. But let's get to the bottom line of what this means. Do not desire what is your neighbor's. In other words, at the bottom of this whole problem is we have stopped reflecting the one we're supposed to reflect. And we're starting to reflect one another's desires and confusions. And this, if it goes unchecked, will escalate into violence. And that violence becomes eventually manifested in murder, which is the very foundation of the sacrificial system. I don't have time to go into that now, but it's exciting to see how Jesus comes to overturn our sacrificial system. Because what is the perfect sacrifice to a God who says he does not desire sacrifices and offerings? It's the sacrifice that forever invalidates our sacrificial systems. So, man loses sight of God. We start reflecting one another. Jesus comes, the Word, God's original thought. What God intended for man to be. This Word, this thought becomes flesh. He is the true light that comes to enlighten every man. And I love the Message translation. I think there it's even more accurate, although it's a paraphrase. In verse 13 where it says, and to those who embrace him, who receive him, he gives the power to become their true selves, their Son of God selves. In other words, Jesus doesn't come to an alien nation or to adopt a fatherless humanity. No, the idea of adoption, look at it in Galatians. The Jewish idea of adoption was not, you are fatherless and I'll be merciful to you and take you into my family. No, it's the idea of a young child is still not at the age where he can participate in the family business, so we hand him over to a tutor. This tutor will teach him the family business, whether it's farming, whether it's this or whatever, until he comes of age where he can be a son, a full participant. Then the adoption takes place. In other words, humanity was never fatherless. Jesus comes to adopt his own. You have lived in your confusion and your illusions for long enough. And the tutor, the law, has had its opportunity to bring us to the only conclusion. And that is that we need more than a tutor. We need a father. And so he comes to reflect again the original idea of what God had when he thought of man. Now, Jesus, being fully human, is not born omniscient, omnipresent, or omnipotent. He is fully human. He lays aside all divine privileges, takes upon himself all the limitations of the human condition. And in this place, he has to access the mind of his Father, just like we do, through conversation, through prayer. He accesses the mind of his Father. He grows in wisdom and understanding. And he refuses to reflect his culture. He refuses to reflect simply his environment. He refuses to simply be the product of his family environment, his community environment, his national environment. He sees that he has a Father who reveals to him an identity beyond all the identities we've created for ourselves. Because, psychologists will tell us that a person's sense of identity is your ability to look at yourself as a separate entity. It's something unique to humanity. Our dogs and cats, they can have wonderful personalities, but you don't see your dog at the end of the day sitting down and thinking, how did relationships go today? I should really work on how harshly I speak to my neighbor. Now, this is unique to humanity. We can consider ourselves as a separate entity in relationship with other entities. And what we do to give us security is we find other entities to attach ourselves to. And we attach ourselves, we attach ourselves to our family. We have attachment to our career, attachment to our race, our culture, these are the big things that gives us a sense of security. This is where I belong. This is all my attachments. Jesus comes to introduce us to a dimension called eternity, in which every temporal entity with which you have attached yourself disappears. And he says, who are you now? Because you see, in the context of eternity, there is no race. There is no culture. There is no language. Paul even goes as far as saying, there is an identity in Christ in which there is neither male nor female. How much of your sense of identity has dependent on your gender? And God comes and he says, no, there's something much greater that defines you. Something beyond all these temporal entities. You were made to reflect me. You were made to be loved. You were made to be adored. And you see, once you discover his adoration, once you discover that this is the one connection that defines you, then all the other connections become so much more valuable. So I don't cling to this relationship because it gives me a sense of value. No, I have this connection because I am the source of its value. I can give it value. I don't cling to my nationality because this is my only sense of identity. No, I've discovered an identity beyond. my race, my language, my nationality. And now I can add value to all those things and to what it means. So Jesus comes, and the one thing that I want to look at this morning is how he models the way in which we value people. Because if there's one thing clear in how Jesus handles himself with people, is he doesn't value them for their talents, for their gifts, for their performance, for their achievement, for what they could contribute to his campaign. I mean, what is so upsetting about Jesus is the fact that he deliberately chooses the outcasts. He's embarrassing. I mean, he goes to places where no one would go. I mean, in John 4, he sits at that well, and he is tired and weary after much travel. I'm so glad Jesus gets tired and weary. Lots of travel as well. He's fully human. Woo! He sits there. Now, this is in a culture in which you did not even speak to a woman in public. Okay, this is not done. Especially not in Samaria. I mean, Samaria are the outcasts. Now, this woman is an outcast amongst the outcasts. Because she's not just a Samaritan. She has got a record of relationship after relationship that did not work. She's the talk of the town. I mean, if there's problems between you and your husband, lock your husband up when this woman comes by, because, I mean, she's been through 6. So she's the outcast amongst the outcasts. And Jesus speaks to her openly. He starts telling her about a source of living water within. And she thinks, okay, he's a bit weird. Says, where are you going to get something to get me this water? And he says, well, go call your husband. And she says, I don't have a husband. And he says, well, that's nicely put. I have no husband because you've had 5. And the one you have now is not your husband. Now she realizes, I'm talking to a prophet. I better start speaking religion. So her next question is, where do you go to church? Because the Samaritan says we must worship God on this mountain, but you Jew says we must worship him there. And Jesus says, hey, the time is coming, and now is, where you will worship God neither here nor there. Verse 23 in the Message, it's so beautiful. It says, it is who you are. I mean, couldn't he have chosen a better candidate for such a beautiful revelation? Is it really who this woman is that God chose to make his place of most sacred encounter? You see, Jesus comes to reveal to us this a faith that allows us to see value in the most wasted life. Why is it that the tax collectors, the prostitutes, gather around him in Luke 15? Why do they run to him? I mean, why not run to all the other messengers? I think if they wanted to feel more condemned for who they were, they could probably have attended just about any religious gathering in town. But they gather to Jesus because there's something about him that communicates value. There's something about him that no matter who you are, where you've been, how you have failed in the world's system, God sees value. And when he tells the story of a lost coin, lost sheep, lost son, a lost coin does not lose its value. Hey, the only reason a person can be lost is because they belong. You cannot be lost unless you belong. And Jesus sees value. Let me tell you what, you don't have to discover just the most perfect 3-step way of how to introduce your friends to Christ. The thing that's going to make you more effective than anything else is discover their value. And you can just sit around the table and just think you're valuable. No one will have to have taught you how to share the gospel. Your genuine conviction of them will overflow in your attitude, in your words. We had a friend, I don't know if I can tell the whole story. I'll try and do it quickly. We had an amazing opportunity. I might have told this before. Stop me if I did. We went to Szeged prison in Hungary. And it was just a divine opening for us to get in there because they have never allowed foreigners in there. And we understood why. It's a maximum security prison in an Eastern European country. It's a tough place to be in. We had an amazing time there. This is just background to what happened a few weeks later. Our friend Joseph was sitting in a barber shop. He was with us as our interpreter. And the message has captured Joseph's heart, the message of man's value. And he was just sharing with the barber how we were in that prison 2 weeks ago. And the barber said, why do you waste your time with people like that? And Joseph starts sharing with him how a lost coin never loses its value. And as he starts sharing the value of man, he didn't notice, but 2 men came and sat on either side. Amazing how God orchestrates these things. And one of the men spoke up and he said, is what you're saying true about me? Joseph said, without a doubt, he said, that prison you spoke about, I spent 20 years there. I just came out a year and a bit ago. He said, if this is true, you've got to come share this with my family. Turns out he's the head of a criminal organization, and the guy sitting on the other side's a hitman. And the hitman says, I can't wait for the weekend. So they got together the next day, I think, and Joseph just shared with him the fact that God still sees value. And this man starts weeping, and he says, you don't understand, I never cry. You're the first man who sees my tears and is alive. And as he was sharing with him his value, the guy just said, you've got to come with me to the prostitutes because they run all the brothels and things. But the moment he discovered his value, those whom they used and abused became valuable. Now, afterwards, Joseph shared with me and he said, if you had to tell me a year ago that I've got to share the gospel with a criminal boss and a hitman, I would have just broken out in a cold sweat. But when you discover people's value, it is natural to communicate value. And there is nothing that will give your life greater meaning and significance and value than awakening the value in others. There's something much more worthwhile to pursue than success. Pursuing success will frustrate you. Now, Jesus shows us the only way to find self-fulfillment is not to pursue self-fulfillment, but to lose yourself, to give yourself. Let me tell you, you haven't lived until you have given yourself. Spontaneously, unreservedly, completely, without expecting anything in return, joyfully. I mean, Jesus comes and he just wastes his life upon us. What kind of success is this? A successful Messiah that comes to die just like all the other false messiahs. Wow. So, he discovers a value in people that allows him to extend his inclusion far beyond his family circles, far beyond his community, far beyond his nationality. Jesus is going a bit overboard. He's even speaking about love your enemies. I mean, this is weird. I mean, tolerate your enemies, kill them humanely. You know, that we can understand. But love, how do you love somebody who deliberately and specifically seeks your harm? I tell you what, you can't do it unless you see what God sees when He loved us, when we were at enmity against Him. What did God see in us that caused Him to love us even while we were His enemies? If His love for us was based on our actions and our deeds, He would not have loved us. If His love for us was based on the fact that we agreed with Him, we repented, we believed just right, then none of us would have had any hope. But it's when we were dead in our trespasses and sins, when we were at enmity against Him, God saw something more in us than what we saw in ourselves. And it's only when you look at your enemy and you start realizing, I know something about you that you do not even know yourself. I know this enmity is not you. It's the absence of you. This enmity is you not being yourself. You've got to come to that conclusion that there's something more true. If Jesus showed us anything, it is, hey, I would rather suffer your violence than enforce violence upon you. I would rather suffer your injustice than enforce your sense of justice upon you. Love your enemies. Goodness me. Why? Because we see value. You know, for a long time we were told God loves us, and who knows why. We've got no clue why. It's so good to know that God's love is not blind. God's not fooling Himself when He says He loves you. Have this idea of God puts on blood-sprinkled glasses that He looks at you so that He can love you. And if ever they slip off and He sees the real you, He'll go, oh my goodness. No, what God achieved in Christ so thoroughly and completely dealt with everything that stood between you, that God can look at you and say, you are blameless, innocent, attractive, beautiful, adorable, desirable to me. I've chosen you because I desire you. And when we see that, that's what He sees in me. And Paul discovers this. He discovers a God who doesn't love him once he renounces his old religious ways. He discovers a God who just comes and I'm so glad Jesus and the Father didn't sit up there and have a negotiation. Should we deal with this guy, Paul? I mean, he's totally set against us. We shouldn't interfere with his free will. Now, you see, God understands that there is no person whose will is free who does not know Him. No one rejects Him with a free will. You reject Him because your will is bound to illusions. You reject Him because you don't see Him for who He is. And God reveals Himself to Paul. And this same Paul, who is in absolute enmity against God, he discovers a God who takes the initiative to make Himself known. And the effect of this on Paul's life is phenomenal. Now, here's a guy being more zealous than anyone else in his religious efforts to try and gain God's approval. His mindset within his previous religious experience was one of transaction. I behave the way God wants me to behave, and God blesses me. I mess up, and He disciplines me. And the whole relationship under that old system is transactional. It's one of transaction. I do my part, you do your part. Jesus introduces him to something much more than transaction, to romance. Because He comes and just gives Himself without any negotiation. You can't negotiate with God because He's got nothing more to give you than what He has given you already. How are you going to negotiate? What is it He has to give you that He hasn't given already? No, the only thing you can do is wake up, realize, appreciate, enjoy the enormity of what He's done. And so, He redefines boundaries. I so love the fact, Ephesians 2, that He comes and He strips away the dividing walls between Jews and Gentiles. I mean, this is the big dividing wall, is between Jews, Gentiles. We've raised up other boundary walls in our time, but the big one is, are you part of God's people or not? That's the ultimate question. And Jesus comes and He just obliterates the dividing wall that stood beyond the chosen and the not chosen. Because God's promise has always been, Genesis 12:3, in you, Israel, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. And God comes to be faithful to what He promised by obliterating every wall between us. Because we so easily want to raise these walls. And He says, in Christ, He creates one new man. God has only got one definition of man. There's people who believe it, and people who don't. Now what we've done is we put another boundary between believers and unbelievers. You see, God has got one definition of man, and He wants you to see what He sees. Because if you see what He sees, you're going to act towards those who are at enmity against Him the way He acted towards us when we were at enmity against Him. And that is to embrace us while we were at our worst. I'm so grateful that Jesus didn't wait for us to realize how wrong we were and repented before He forgave us. It was while we were nailing Him to that cross that He says, Father, forgive them. Because they're just stupid. They don't know what they're doing. This is a result of their ignorance. And so He creates one new man. Some believe it, some don't, but their unbelief, their confusion does not confuse God. God never bought into Adam's deception. God remained the same. He knew who you were all along. He still does. So, this suddenly causes Paul who was so zealous, religious, to pursue favor with God. In Galatians 3, he writes, I am no longer driven to impress God. Yet, he works harder. He says, I work harder than all of you, yet not I, but the grace of God within me. You know, there's a time where we discover the finished work of Christ and we say, whoo, all that religious effort is behind me. I'm entering the rest of God. My goodness, thank you. And we discover it in every area of our life. We suddenly think, oh my goodness, God is not upset if I missed my Bible study this morning. And although for 10 years I tried to become more faithful and faithful, suddenly I discover His favor is consistent and we just relax. It's no longer the transaction. And you know, that's a good thing to go through. Sometimes it's good to say, hey, you know what? I'm going to wake up late, just make it in time for a coffee and work. And on the way to work with my coffee, I'm just going to say, hey, Jesus, you still like me? You're still with me? Although I didn't do all of the stuff I used to do. That's a good phase to go through. But then there's a place where you need to discover that this rest is the most active rest you're going to ever enter. This is not a rest of weariness or tiredness. This is the rest of satisfaction. Where I suddenly discover that I have God's approval. I can't sleep. I just want to, God's in love with me. I want to go spend some time with Him. I want to get up a little bit earlier and just, converse. The fact that Mary Ann has given herself to me and we are together 24/7 doesn't mean there aren't times where I just want to hide away with her. I want to. Let's take a few days, and it's like in Song of Songs, come away with me, my beloved. I want to see your face. Your face only. Hear your voice. And so there's a place where you need to go through. Yes, we've got rid of the religious efforts of doing Bible study and all of this. We enter this place of freedom and rest. Don't stay there. Enter the romance that will drive you beyond what the law ever required. The same with giving and every other thing. Yes, there was a time where we thought that our giving is protection money to a God who's looking at every opportunity to get in our case. And yes, then we discover, no, this God has already given us His all. His favor is not based on your giving. And then many of us mad at being lied to for so long, just quit giving. I'm not giving ever again. I've been lied to. Hey, move on and discover the joy of being fully and truly yourself, because you cannot be yourself unless you give yourself. If Jesus shows us anything, it is in giving yourself that you become fully and truly yourself. And so you are generous not because you have to, but because you're made in the image and the likeness of a God who gives his all. Behold him. Behold him. And suddenly this Paul, who speaks about the secret of contentment. And I'm so glad we have his life to explain to us what he meant by that. His life was not a life of seclusion in a Turkish spa where they fed him grapes and waved him with palm trees. It's not at that stage where he wrote, I discovered the secret of contentment. He says, I've been beaten 40 stripes less one. 5 times. You know, they'd give you 40 less 1 because most people died at stripe 40. These things would rip pieces of flesh out of your back. And if you survived it, you'd be deformed. 5 times. You would think he'd learned after the second time. If I say that, they're going to beat me. But Paul discovered a message more delightful than life itself. The message more says, I love that's better than wine. I mean, this is an intoxicating experience. Shipwrecked. Once he was shipwrecked, how many days? 3 days and nights. We didn't even see the sun. I mean, it was a storm. Now, this is the Paul who says, I'm not doing anything because I'm trying to impress God. This is the Paul who says, everything I do is because I've discovered that God is already so impressed with me that he impressed his own image and likeness upon me. In other words, this is the God who's already given his all, and I now live not to gain something. I live out of gratitude. I live out of thankfulness. I'm not living trying to still find fulfillment. I'm living out of a place of satisfaction. And I tell you, this is dangerous. It will drive you beyond what religious obligation has ever driven you. Because this place of satisfaction has nothing to lose. His place of fulfillment has nothing to lose. Jesus doesn't come to offer you a nice, cozy, secure, predictable, respectable life. He comes to offer you his own adventurous, dangerous, risky self. He says, are you ready for the adventure of your life? I want to love through you. I want to live through you. I've designed you so that I can be uniquely myself in you. That's what you are designed for. And so this Paul going through all these things, I mean, washing up after a shipwreck, gathering wood, tired, worn out, puts it on a fire and a snake bites him, a poisonous snake. Everyone watches him to see when is he going to puff up and die. Now, if Paul bought into our charismatic theories on how the blessing and the curse works, this would be the ideal time for Paul to say, am I in God's will? For a snake hanging off his hand. This is my 3rd shipwreck. I'm deformed from all the beatings. Everyone's waiting for me to puff up and die, because they, as if the thoughts won't be strong enough in Paul's own mind, they are saying, even though he escaped the shipwreck, justice will not allow him to live. This is why the snake bit him. Now, Paul discovered that there is only one event in his life that reveals the heart and the favor of God towards him. And that's the event in which God gave himself. And now every contradiction becomes an opportunity to once again affirm, God's for me. So he just shakes off that snake. He discovered the God who said, who introduced him to resurrection life. Resurrection life is not the kind of life that avoids death. It's called resurrection life because this kind of life says, hey, evil, have your best shot. Give me all you've got. And when they murdered him, he just rose again. He just reverses it. Say, is this all you've got? Hey, death, where's your victory? Hey, hell, where's your sting? Come on. You can do all you can. I'll just reverse it. This Jesus reveals that evil does not have the last say in your life. Oh man, I must summarize and conclude. So let me see, what do I conclude with? God did not design you to frustrate or irritate him. He didn't, in this place of intimate fellowship and enjoyment and fulfillment in the fellowship in the Trinity, God didn't think, what kind of being can we create that will irritate the living daylights out of us for the rest of eternity? Now, this God who knew the end from the beginning, in this place of absolute fulfillment and enjoyment, imagines a being that can participate in this fellowship without reducing the quality of the enjoyment and the love and the relationship within God, who is a community of fellowship. This God designed you, not because he was homeless, just looked for a container, or just because he needed some entertainment. No, you were designed as his image and likeness because he wanted to find expression through you. It's this God who in himself is the creative source, the creative process, the creative end result of his own creative genius, who within himself thought continually of new ways of being uniquely himself. And it is in this creative process that he thought of you. That you would be an expression of him. He doesn't desire to manipulate you, to control you. He's got one desire: to set you free. To be fully and truly yourself. Because when you are being yourself, God is being himself in you. This is why Ephesians 5 verse 1, I'm closing again. Ephesians 5 verse 1 says, be imitators of your Father. The Greek word mimetic. Remember we spoke about mimetic theories? Mimetis. Be mimetis. Imitate, mimic your Father. What does your Father do? He loves. When you love, God is being himself in you. Papa, we thank you for just stirring such an awareness of your presence, of your closeness, of that we can behold you. And as we behold you, we are what we were always designed to be, beholding you as in a mirror. We are transformed to be what we've always been. Thank you, Lord. Amen.